everyone, I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I finally have another book review, and that is James Clavell's Noble House. Noble House is part of Clavell's Asian saga, which also consists of books like Shogun, King Rat, Taipan, and Whirlwind. Of the series, which I believe consists of 6 or 7 books, I've only read 3. I've read Shogun, King Rat, and now Noble House. Shogun being one of my favorite books of all time, and King Rat also being a great book that I read a couple of years ago that's still stuck in my head since I read it. Noble House takes place in 1963 Hong Kong and follows Ian Dunros, who's a Taipan. And for those of you who don't know what a Taipan is, they are Chinese entrepreneurs or executives. He is the head of Struan's Company, which is a very old trading company in Hong Kong, which was founded by one of his relatives, one of his ancestors named Dirk Struan, who was a pirate during the Opium Wars between China and Great Britain. So Ian Dunros is of English descent. He's from Scotland, actually. And as he's inherited it, he's decided to make the company public, which is a bold move because every Taipan before him has kept Struan's company as private. And that's the bare minimum of plot setup for this book. I'm going to go into more of the plot later because, like James Clavell's other books, specifically Shogun, this plot is dense to say the least. So in addition to Ian Dunros' character, who I would consider to be the main character of the book, there's also Casey Chillick and Link Bartlett, who are American businessmen trying to break into this Hong Kong business world and trying to seek profit in that and try to become Taipans themselves. There's Quillian Gaunt, who is another Taipan living in Hong Kong, who also inherited a company with as much lineage as Ian Dunros' Struan's company. There are KGB spies, there are Taiwan nationalists, Maoist nationalists, there are Hong Kong police, there are British nationalists, there's a British governor running Hong Kong. There are just so many characters with so many different allegiances and political beliefs, which makes sense because 1963, this is the Cold War, and all this kind of converges together into one really dense plot that is probably evidence that James Clavell is at least a literary genius, considering how he managed to take all these different characters with all these different motivations and make what is ultimately a coherent plot. But what I feel like is James Clavell's greatest strength with Noble House is the slice of life aspect of this book. It takes place in 1 week, so each section, I guess, is divided by what day it is. So it starts on a Tuesday and ends on a Tuesday, and each chapter in between each day has a time. So it's like Tuesday 7:15 a.m. Next chapter will be 9:15 a.m. etc. etc. And I think that really helps add to this element of you're observing just 1 week in the crazy financial life that is in Hong Kong at this time, as there are so many different factions from all over the world trying to sway the state of Hong Kong, which at the time was under British control, which was obviously facing a lot of stress from the Chinese government, from the British government itself, from communist parties, from the KGB in Russia, and the Soviet Union, from the US trying to get into this market, and all that just kind of comes to a head. And especially with Ian Dunros' character, you understand that it's just 1 week in his life, and despite the fact that he has this huge empire that's lasted generations, and he has such an incredible amount of wealth and sway, all that can come crumbling down either by his own mistake or by something that has nothing to do with him. And I think that's really fascinating, and helps with this plot because, as I said, it's very dense, and if it was a traditionally told book, you would expect all the plot lines to have satisfying conclusions, but with the fact that this is just 1 week in these people's lives, it sort of makes sense that ultimately I was satisfied with how every single individual plot went. But so just like in the real world, not everyone's going to have a satisfying character arc for every single thing they try to accomplish, and I think that really works here because there are some plots that just end when the week ends, and you get the feeling like it's going to keep going because these people's lives don't stop because the book ends. This is just a slice of life, and it does a good job of ending the character arcs you care about and the stories that you really care about. But, Ian Dunros is still going to have tons of different obstacles ahead of him in the future. He's overcome a ton of them in a matter of a week, but ultimately it's not going to end until he resigns as Taipan or until he retires and lets someone else inherit it. And I think that's really great, and I think that really adds the complexity of the plot, because this is the Cold War, and unlike a lot of the wars that came before, there aren't really any clear-cut good guys and bad guys. It's just factions trying to get what they think is for the best. And I think Clavell's strength as a writer comes out here because he's able to depict each side with sort of an objective lens. He likes Ayn Rand books. He likes big businessmen that take charge and do things on their own. And you can tell with characters like Ian Dunrose, Link Bartlett, who represents like the American side in Parcon Industries, who's trying to carve like an empire of his own in Hong Kong. And you get the feeling that he really loves these specific types of people in real life. But also with the KGB characters and some of the communist characters, because there are some members of the British Communist Party in this book as well. You get the feeling like he at least acknowledges their own beliefs and why they believe in what they believe in. There's a character named Suslov who's a KGB spy in Hong Kong. And he's never really depicted as being a bad guy. He's just a guy who was born in the Soviet Union and has different sets of beliefs than the Western capitalist characters like Ian Dunrose. And although he is sort of at odds with Ian Dunrose, he isn't really depicted as being a true bad guy. And no one's really depicted as being a true bad guy either. And I think that's really interesting because even if you disagree with James Clavell's political beliefs, I think that you can still find characters that you relate to, and you can still at least appreciate his ability to tell stories here. I'm not very knowledgeable in economics and stock markets, but he's able to write these situations and these conflicts in a way where I can at least understand the bare minimum of what's going on, who's in trouble, and what their strategies are. But there's also a love for Hong Kong. So as I said, James Clavell wrote the Asian Saga, and he spent a lot of his time living in Japan and in Hong Kong because he just loved traveling there, and he just loved the culture so much. And I think like Shogun, which is in Japan, and there's so much love for Japanese culture in that book, there's also a tremendous amount of love and detail of Hong Kong culture at the time. This is a very unique area of the world during the Cold War, as it's technically under British control, but also it's just facing so much adversity and conflict from all these different countries and companies who, it's basically the Wild West of China at the time, I would say, because everyone is just trying to take advantage of this free market that causes people to do crazy things and lets people get away with crazy things as well, because it's just basically chaos all the time. And there's so much little details. Like, there'll be just a random chapter where you follow this random Hong Kong native who's lived a horrible life on a farm and talks about like how his family was treated when the communists came in and had to retreat to Hong Kong. And then that character's never seen again, but you get like this little glimpse of the average worker in Hong Kong. You get a little glimpse into their life, and I think that's really great. And I love that attention to detail. And you get insights into the Triad at the time and how companies and countries would manipulate the Triad into covering up their own nefarious deeds, their own illegal deeds as well. Because this is basically a spy drama, a Cold War spy drama. And ultimately you can tell that all this was all researched from the political landscape at the time to Hong Kong culture from a variety of different points of view. And you really can't get that kind of description, that kind of attention to detail from other writers, in my opinion, because like Shogun, James Clavell does his research. He has an appreciation and love for these different cultures. It makes the 1,300 plus page count worth going through because in addition to having these great characters that are, have their pros and cons as people, as most real life people have as well, there's also this analysis of a very unique time period in a very unique area of the world. That being said, I would say that Noble House would not be the book I would start reading if I wanted to get into James Clavell's books. I started with Shogun, and I would say the first couple hundred pages were brutal to get through because he just dumps tons of information on at you, tons of characters, tons of characters with tons of different philosophies in life, all different motivations, different political beliefs, etc., etc. And I would say that's almost double the amount in Noble House. I would say my biggest problem with this book is that the plots, introductions, the character introductions basically don't stop. There's always something new going on. There's so many characters with such different goals. It's going to be hard to balance them all. And I think the 1,300 page runtime, the 1,300 page length helps that a lot because you get a lot of time with different characters. But there are times where you stop seeing a character for a long period of time, you kind of forget about them. And then when they come back, it's sort of jarring for a second, I would say. And just like the sheer amounts of plots in general, it can be very daunting, and I was constantly rereading parts to understand more fully what was going on. Luckily, I had already read 2 James Clavell's books, so I kind of knew what I was getting into before I got into it. But I can see someone who's never read a James Clavell book before getting into this book and being like, this is just too much. Because you're like halfway through the book and they're still introducing new plots, and you still barely grasp the plots that they were introduced in the beginning of the book as well. So that's obviously something to look out for. I think, as I said, with the slice of life sort of mentality of how this book is written, that elevates the writing. That enhances the chaotic writing style of this book, the chaotic plot structure, I should say. Obviously, it's still chaotic and it's still a lot to grasp, and I would still say do not start with this book. I would say you probably be best starting off with King Rat, because it's the shortest book, it's his first book, and it's technically a prequel to Noble House, which I didn't realize later on, because I was reading the book, and then characters from King Rat were showing up in this book, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I'd recommend with that first. And then read Shogun, probably, because Shogun is, like, the best book ever. But there's this weird, like, Game of Thrones mentality to this book. It's almost modern day, obviously 1963, which wasn't that far away, but these companies have such familial significance. As I said, Ian Dunros is like the 10th person to inherit this company, and it started with Dirk Struan, who was a pirate who founded this company during like the bloodshed that was the Opium Wars, and his arch rival Quillian Gortz, who's a Taipan of another company, has like this bitter hatred for Ian Dunros that just is centuries and generations in the making, because their families have been at odds for literally generations. So in addition to wanting to improve their own company by taking down the rival company, they also have personal and selfish interest in taking each other down as well. And I found that really interesting, because they have to be civil with each other in public spheres, but when they're alone, the hatred really comes to the forefront. I like juxtaposition in characters. They're not just one. They don't just have one personality. They have different faces They have different faces for different situations, which I find to be really great and fairly realistic as well. And even then, Quillian Gorn, despite the fact that he's going against the protagonist, isn't necessarily the bad guy of the book. He's just a guy with different motivations. He has reasons to hate Ian Dunros that you can understand through his own thought process. And at times, like, you kind of want to root for him as well, even though he's basically going against the main character, but he still has goals. He still is sympathetic in different ways. And just that decision to write as objectively as possible in this book, I find to be really admirable on James Clavell's part. So that is my review for Noble House. I would give this a big recommendation if what I said before sounds appealing to you. I would say do not start with this book if you want to get into James Clavell, because it's very daunting, and I think you should know what you're getting into before you actually read it. I would say the biggest deficit of the book is its immense plot and all the different intricacies of the plot going on with different characters and just different factions that were also taking place in the real world that were implemented perfectly into this book, in my opinion. But I would say that because the plot is so dense that the prose often focuses too much on it, I would go back to Shogun, and there's this really great scene that really stuck with me that I haven't read the book in 3 years or so, and it still sticks with me. There's just a scene where 2 characters are speaking to each other, but they're communicating through haiku. And the scene's really beautiful and really intelligently written. And you don't really get those kind of scenes here in Noble House, because Clavell is trying to get the plot done because it's so immense, and he's trying to, fulfill his vision to like the extent that he wants it to be. But I think that kind of takes away from some of his brilliant prose that are in some of his other books. Not too much, but it does at times feel like you're just kind of reading plot for the sake of reading plot. But that being said, I think that if you like James Clavell, like me, this is a perfect book to read. I finished it a couple days ago, and I'm missing it. It took me over a month to read, and I got so attached to these characters that now that the book is done, I'm kind of missing them in a way. They feel like they became part of my life, and I think that speaks volumes to the ability to write characters that James Clavell has. So if this sounds interesting to you, I recommend that you read it. If you haven't read the book, I want to know what you think about it in the comments below. Also, if you've read any of other James Clavell books that you want to recommend to me, I'd be interested in hearing. I'm interested in hearing what you say about Shogun because I just love that book so much. So thank you if you got this far. I have other reviews and stuff on my channel. Great Gatsby video. I have a Sun Also Rises video, which is just about me talking about my traveling history, while also kind of talking about Sun Also Rises, but not as much. I have a video on my reading habits too, which I just uploaded, which you should check out as well. And check out my friends' channels, Tyler Talks and Drunzo. All of you already know who Drunzo is, and all of you probably know who Tyler Talks is as well, because that's where my subscriber base comes from those two people. But they have other great videos as well. I'll link the channels in the description below. Thank you so much, and goodbye.